Hi, and welcome to our Jim2 webinar on when you should and shouldn't use Unprint. A common thing I hear when I talk to customers is that they don't know what they don't know. And as such, we'll be going right back to basics for each topic to make sure that you're all fully informed of each section. At the end of each session, we'll have a Q&A in which you can type any question you like into chat, and we'll either answer live or get back to you with an answer after our webinar. The webinar will also be uploaded to our website so you can rewatch if you wanted to go over something again, or you can let someone know that's not on today so they can see the info also. These webinars and other short informational videos are available in our Learning Resources Centre at jim2.com, looking under Resources. And before we get started, I wanted to thank everyone that filled out the surveys ahead of this webinar. It was a great source of information about how our customer base uses the Unprint button. So let's start on today's topic, Jim2 and unprinting jobs. I've wanted to start today with an intention. That intention is the original idea for how the Unprint button was to be used. It was intended for error correction only. That is to say, if a mistake has been made on a job, but it has had the invoice generated, you can easily wind that error back. There can be unintended consequences, however, including missed payments, oversupply of goods, or any number of issues that could cost your business money. Some of our users will already know this, but in many cases where you would use Unprint, there's probably a more accurate way to represent what has happened in a job, a PO, or even a stock transfer. It might be a good idea to describe what happens when you choose to unprint a job. Everything associated with the actions of creating an invoice are reversed. You're effectively saying this job was completed in error and that you need to fix it. This means that if you're unprinting an invoice, you're actually deleting the invoice or returning the job back to a ready-to-invoice state. In terms of auditing, you'll only see an object unprinted line in your comments or email grid. No other records will be available because you're removing information from the database. Believe me, if we kept every piece of information that was overwritten or deleted, your database would absolutely balloon in size. As unprinting is effectively deleting something, I will offer a word of warning. If you've provided an invoice to someone, you should be very cautious when unprinting. I would go as far as saying that if a document has been provided to someone, whether it's a purchase order, invoice, or anything that can act as a legal record, you should never unprint. There is another situation in which you should never unprint. If you're an MPS customer, you should never unprint a job that has a meter read. The problems that can stem from this are so vast and varied, it is just not worth the risks. If you're in an MPS business and feel that you need to unprint a job that has a meter read, please give our support team a call to discuss what options you have. Another thing to be cautious of is the security for unprinting. It can be set very differently from the security for any of the alternatives that I'm proposing today. Be sure to check your security setup to ensure that your staff have the security settings they need to work in the way that you need them to. In fact, I'd recommend that you restrict the ability to unprint so that only certain members of your team can perform this function. Before we check who has access to unprint things, it can be a good idea to have a quick check on who can access the security settings. An easy way to do this is to go to Tools and then Security. And then click the top tab labeled by Group. Tick Users to include all of your staff, and then we want to highlight the line that we want to check. So we can expand Tools, expand Security, and then highlight the top. Now, I can slide the screen to the right to see everyone that has access to see, edit, add, or delete in the security settings. Okay, looks like everyone that's meant to have access to this demo system does. Now we can check who has access to Unprint jobs. In the same area, Tools and Securities, we can minimize the Tools section and expand jobs. There are three to look out for: Unprint docket jobs, Unprint manufacturing, and if we expand invoice, Unprint invoice. I'd recommend that you do this for all staff that do not require the ability to delete things, and only have a few staff that have that ability. Some feel that this may slow down their processes, but I personally feel that if something's being deleted at my business, I'd like to know about it. Okay, so we've sorted out who can and cannot unprint. Let's take a look at the unprinting process and some problems that may occur. Okay, so here we have a job, and I've realized that I've accidentally applied it to the wrong client. So I'll need to unprint the invoice and attach it to the right client. Let's see what happens if we click Unprint. So first we would need to enter an invoice number so Jim2 knows which invoice to unprint, but I immediately can see our first issue. Just under the invoice number is a tick box. This tick box is asking us if we wish to reverse any payments associated with this invoice. Considering that this job is set to an incorrect client, this is a really important checkbox. But let's suppose for the moment that we've missed ticking it and continued unprinting anyway. Maybe we were moving too fast to correct an issue while a customer was waiting, or maybe we've done it so many times before that we're confident we always do it right, and this time we just missed it. Whatever the reason, now we have some problems. Number one, the correct customer's card code will not show that a payment has been made. Number two, the incorrectly selected client will have a credit against their card code. Number three, if the rogue payment is not found, the till or FPOS will not reconcile for that day. Number four, when you do find the payment that is on the incorrect customer, you'll need to perform a debtor's adjustment up on it and a debtor's adjustment down on the correct client. This can also create a domino effect of issues which could be avoided entirely by not using Unprint. If left unattended, these kinds of issues can spiral and cause a lot of problem at month's end. This can be especially true if the unprinting happened at the start of the month. You may need to have your accounts team checking every job and payment over the month to find the discrepancies. Okay, so what could we do as an alternative to this situation? Well, personally, I like to know when mistakes have been made. I like to keep a record of those mistakes just in case anything comes back about it in the future. If this comes back in an unexpected way, I'd like to know what had happened at this time. So in this case, I'll perform a return from customer. This will create a credit for the amount on the incorrect client's account, which will return him to a $0 balance. It will return the stock into inventory, and it will allow us to put a note against the RFC stating that it was attached to the incorrect client in error. If we instead chose to unprint, we could have a rogue payment, a customer that is paid without a record of that payment, and a till that will not reconcile. We would have no record of the issue that occurred, except for a line on the job that simply states, invoice unprinted. As you may be able to tell, there's not necessarily anything wrong with the action of unprinting itself. In fact, there can be very legitimate reasons to perform an unprint. If you're closing a job days after it was completed and you forget to change the date on the invoice, This can be pretty common when finishing up jobs at the end of the month. If you have a requirement to enter a customer's purchase order number in the customer reference field, but missed doing it before you printed the invoice. Updating shipping information is another legitimate use of unprinting, especially when the client has told you about the update after you've created the invoice. Just as there are legitimate reasons to unprint an invoice, there are scenarios in which you do not want to unprint an invoice. If a customer already has a copy of the invoice and the changes you want to make will change that invoice, do not unprint. If you do choose to do this, there will effectively be two invoices that could have the same invoice number that contain different information. And again, if you're an MPS business and a job has a meter read on it, do not unprint. Please give us a call. Okay, so how about we talk about another scenario that might be a bit common, and that is adding stock to a job. I'm sure we've all had this happen. The customer's at the counter, and as you hit print on the invoice, they say, "Oh, didn't know you had these. I might grab one." Okay, we could unprint the invoice, or we could put through another sale. But which is easier? We've already described some of the problems when unprinting, and this is no different. They all apply here, but let's think about it in a slightly different way. A common way to measure something in software terms is to measure how many clicks it takes to accomplish a task. I didn't want to count the clicks as I'm presenting today, so I've taken the liberty of calculating both amounts. To create a new job would take around 12 clicks, including the payment. To unprint and add the stock to the job and redo the invoice was over 20 clicks, over 24 actually. It may seem faster and easier to unprint and add something to the job, but it can actually be a longer process than just pressing create similar to make a new job. And we have no chance of something being missed because the first transaction has occurred in its entirety and the second in its entirety. An issue that our customers can run into is when a purchase order needs to be unprinted, which can cause some jobs to require unprinting. I did get some comments on this from the survey that was sent out ahead of the webinar, and so I wanted to take the time to explain this process as there does seem to be some confusion here. From a Jim2 point of view, a purchase order is a record of costs that you could then apply to jobs to better show profit that you've made. A purchase order is not the stock itself, it's not the value of that stock. It's a record of the costs that you can then apply to jobs to more easily show your business's profit. When we set a PO to complete, we're saying that that purchase order is an accurate representation of the costs that we have purchased. Okay, so if a PO is to show the job's profit by applying a cost to the job, a job then must be the calculation of that profit or margin. A job can also show communications and a lot of other information, but the goal of a job is to calculate how much profit your business has made. It does this by taking the costs that you've applied to the job and taking that away from the amount you've charged for the job. Therefore, to set a job to complete, at least when we're talking about stock, we're saying that this job is now an accurate representation of the work that has been performed and the goods or labour that has been supplied. So if a purchase order is not accurate, it cannot help jobs accurately calculate profits. This is why when you need to unprint a PO that contains stock that has been used on a job, you must unprint the job. Jim2 is not aware of what you need to edit on the purchase order, and therefore it cannot allow jobs that use that stock to remain finalized. Thinking further than just an individual job, you may not have an accurate picture of the quantity of goods you've received, and any kind of inventory valuation would be meaningless. It would really depend on what was edited. As some alternatives to the situation, instead of unprinting, when changing costs on a PO, we could link an expense order that may be helpful in correcting some of the information. As an example, you may be able to add an expense order for the difference in the cost. If you're correcting the PO because of the quantity of stock, you may need to add another purchase order for the difference. For example, if your purchase order says 2 when you've received 8, you can add another purchase order for 6. If you've been paying attention, you may have noticed the main reason for using the Unprint button, and that is human error. Whether it's the customer that doesn't let you know required information sooner, or maybe your staff are so lightning fast that they lose a bit of accuracy, human error is the most common reason for needing to unprint. Unprinting is more of a precision tool than it is a sledgehammer. It should be used in exact situations rather than using it as a generic reversal tool. With this in mind, the best cure for unprinting is prevention. By ensuring that your staff are competent in Jim2, having security measures to prevent most staff from unprinting, and having a better understanding of how Jim2 operates, you'll be able to handle any issues that used to require unprinting with the right care and attention. Well, we sure covered a lot today about unprinting. Today we covered when you should not unprint, when unprinting is acceptable, some of the dangers associated with unprinting, and some alternatives that you can use. If you ever come across a situation that you're unsure of if you should unprint or not, you can always give us a call for some advice. Now, before we get into the Q&A, this webinar was a little bit different, as we'd sent a survey out beforehand and asked about your experience with the unprinting button. Again, I'd like to thank everyone that's responded to the survey. It made writing this webinar both easier because I could write to your needs, but also harder as some of your needs are a bit out there. I did make a mistake when I created the survey, however, and that was to make it anonymous. There were a few responses that did make us pause and have a think about what you might be trying to achieve. So I don't have any way of identifying who those people were. So if one of the following examples is from you and you would like a little more explanation, please do reach out and let us know. For anyone unaware, there were 2 questions on the survey, and the following is in response to the first question, which was, what situations cause you to unprint when using Jim2? Number 1. The first one's probably a bit of a poor example as it was quite a long response. I do want to continue with it, however, as it presents a great opportunity to learn more about Jim2. I will summarize this one, but essentially they were under the impression that when they needed to unprint a PO, that they needed to remove the stock on the jobs that was from the PO and then unprint the PO. Okay, so no, you don't need to remove the stock from the jobs. You will need to unprint the jobs to make sure that whatever changes you're making on the PO are properly reflected in the jobs that have stock from that PO. Other than that, if you have any troubles here, give our support team a call. The second example was if there was a pricing or freight issue. This one was actually pretty straightforward. We were just not sure how or why freight might be an issue. So if you added this response, maybe reach out so we can understand a little more. We did have another question, which was, what other topics would you like covered in Jim2 webinars? Thank you again for all of the great suggestions. I think you'll find a few popping up with this year. We did have a couple interesting suggestions in response that we thought we could follow up live with. The first was how to change the face of an invoice being sent out to a customer. Can you use colors or bold to show the amount due on the invoice? As many of you are aware, you are able to request customized invoices from Happen at a cost. But what other options do you have outside of that? Our Jim2 4.4 users will have access to Reports v2 or version 2, which is all the same reports from Jim2 4.3, but with the inclusion of color. There are a lot of colors that you can choose from, so you should be able to find something in line with your business's color scheme. Outside of this, you can use a different invoice that is native to Jim2. There are several different invoice styles that you can choose from, so you should be able to find one that suits your business. The second suggestion was taking a look at any automated functions that can be set up, such as the ability to import data to automatically create jobs. We can currently do this with our email rules. Be sure to check out the two-part webinar series on email, particularly the second part on incoming email. That might help you out a bit. Finally, I'd like to thank you all for attending today. I'll leave some information on the screen about how you can get in touch with us. And now I'll hand over to Ian, who can answer any questions you might have about unprinting.
Here and ready to go. So let's work through our questions that we might have.
Fantastic. It doesn't look like anything has quite come through as yet. We might give a couple minutes and see if anything pops up. Ian, you and I were talking earlier about the concept of costs from the purchase orders and how they translate through the jobs. Is that something you can speak to a little bit?
Well, simply that when we sell product, and Jim obviously allocates depleting stock and special stock to those jobs, it carries the costing from the purchase order and carries that into the job itself. So when we look at unprinting a PO and changing costs, that obviously has to be done before a job can be invoiced. If you sell stock from a received PO in a job, which is perfectly fine and everybody does it, then you may see that costings change at the time that you finish that purchase order, and that's perfectly appropriate. A tax invoice comes in after we've received the product. The costs are listed on the purchase order, and as a result of that, those costs then flow through to that job. And when we talk about how we see profit on jobs, remember that we're talking here about management reports. We're talking about reports that are not accounting reports, but are in fact based on the data in the job and the PO. So from time to time, you're going to sell something in a job from a received purchase order that will show an estimated cost on it. And that cost will change once the tax invoice comes in from the supplier and we move the PO to finish. So finishing a PO, very important that you get it right. The whole idea of the finished status is to make sure you've edited it, you've corrected it, you have the correct vendor, you have the correct values, the correct pricing, and you're going to pay the right amount of money to that creditor.
And then the flow-on effect would be those correct costs are then applied to the jobs.
That's correct.
Fantastic. There was one area that I was not really able to write a lot about within the webinar, and maybe it's something you could speak to at the moment, and that is the dangers of unprinting an invoice that contain multiple jobs.
Well, when you do what we call batch invoicing, so that is one invoice, but it refers to more than just the one job, it's very easy to lose track in an unprint of which jobs now need to be re-invoiced and should they be batched or not. So a quick example would be that you had 3 jobs in the system, you wanted to invoice them all to that one customer, so you use the batch invoice technique. Now at an unprint, when you unprint an invoice, it means all 3 of those jobs have come back to an editable state. Therefore, when you go to re-invoice, you've got to remember that you want those 3 jobs in that one invoice. So that can be a bit tricky. We've provided suggestions before about making sure that the same logic you used to put the 3 together in the first place is reapplied. The other thing I would just mention too is, and people who have unprinted jobs will be familiar with this, we bring the jobs back to a ready state. Now, ready means you still need to be able to take it off ready to make any edits to those jobs, such as changing something in the job itself.
Great, thank you. We've got our first question. When finishing, what will be the invoice date if the invoice date is in a closed month? I'm assuming that's closed.
Yeah. The question really refers to the settings that you have in your tools and options. But if you try to close, and I'm presuming are we talking about an invoice or a PO? We'll work on a job invoice. Firstly, you can only invoice to the dates where the periods are open. So Jim2 will go, great, I will need to invoice this job and I need to move it across. If we're trying to use an invoice date on a PO in a closed period, again, depending on your settings, it will force you to put it into the first open period. So if you've closed, for example, June, it will force you to put it into July. Now, again, there are options to these settings and there are security settings that influence this as well. So we need to have a bit of a conversation about those particular settings in your database and how they apply.
Thank you for the question. Fiona has asked, if a PO is received and we invoice the job, then finish the PO at a later date and update the pricing, what COGS will go against the job?
Sure. So the COGS, when we talk about finishing a PO, that's when COGS are actually applied. So there's no, when you receive product and you put it on a received status on a purchase order, there's no change to the asset values in your database. There's no change to the cost of goods. So if you think about that from an accounting point of view, if I invoice a sale for goods that are on a received PO, then in accounting terms, it's 100% profit right at that moment. Now, when the product comes through with a tax invoice on the PO, we put the costs on the purchase order and finish it. At that point, Jim says, now I have costs that I can apply against the asset account that the stock belongs to. And if the goods have been sold, then across to the cost of goods accounts that they apply to. Again, there's a bit of a setting conversation here for us to talk about in tools and options. But ideally, the transaction of the sale is the place where the COGS transaction should be occurring. The movement to the asset account is the date of the invoice on the PO. So yes, if you had a very long period of time between the time that you actually sold the goods from a received PO and you received the tax invoice from your vendor and finished the PO, then you could see journaling in 2 different months.
That makes sense. Fantastic. Thank you for the question, Fiona. I hope that helps. Any other situations that anyone's curious about, or? I think we might be pretty close. Wonderful. Thank you, Tabitha. Okay, we might close it out here, guys. Don't forget that we send out a survey so you can let us know how the webinar has gone. So expect to see that, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks.